Hi, welcome to Memos to the President. I'm Elluru with a special competitive studies project. We're here to talk about the release of another memo. This time, the topic is on governance. So I'm here with two of my colleagues, Rama and Venkat. Welcome.
Good to be here.
To be here.
Before we talk about the memo, like with all of my guests so far and the authors of this memo, I would like for the audience to know more about who you are, where you come from, and what brought you to DC. Rama, do you want to start with you?
Sure. My training is as a patent lawyer, so I have a science and technology background. And then when Congress gave the United States Patent and Trademark Office new jurisdiction to hear disputes between issued patents, I went over to be an administrative patent judge at the USPTO, and there I started working on AI IP policy. And that's when the National Security Commission on AI was set up, and you as executive director were looking for detailees from the government. The director of the USPTO asked if I was interested. I certainly was. I came, I talked to you, saw the mission set. I was like, there's no way I can't be part of this. And again, I thought, intellectual property and AI governance were really important aspects of that mission. So I joined the NSCAI, and then when that dissolved by statute and Special Competitive Studies Project was stood up, I came over here.
And Rama, if I'm not mistaken, you were the judge in the first AI court case.
That's correct.
In the history of our country.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about before we turn over to Venkat?
Sure. So the America Invents Act meant looking at disputes between the patentability looking at the disputes on patentability of issued patents. So patents that are in commerce that people are fighting over, whether it's being infringed, whether that patent should have been issued in the first place. So Congress gave the Patent and Trademark Office this new jurisdiction to look at the validity of issued patents. The America Invents Act went into effect in 2012.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we started implementing these regulations, and it was like a startup because these were new regulations. There was sort of no process in how to implement these regulations. So it was a lot of fun, and I was on the first case, yeah.
That's an incredible history.
Yeah. And I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Venkat?
It's impressive that I've been working for you for a year now, and I didn't know that.
You never even
fun fact about you. You're a part of American history, Rama.
Oh, thank you for that.
And AI.
I have a non-traditional background coming into policy and national security. I studied economics and philosophy at a small liberal arts school in Minnesota. Went to work in tech doing data science, and then worked at Meta studying the quality of our content enforcement classifiers. Then I sort of took a step back, and I knew I always enjoyed thinking about system level problems. And I thought about where in this ecosystem is there the best position to think about system level problems, have the responsibility to enact change, and work with the constituents and folks that issue affects. And the place that came to mind to me was Congress.
Right.
So I took a leap of faith, took a 80% pay cut to take a job at Congress.
Interesting.
And luckily, the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party just got stood up in the 118th Congress a month before I joined. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work on the Select Committee, where I covered global tech competition and specifically looked at AI and semiconductor policy. And so that intersection of emerging technology, geopolitical competition, and national security naturally led me to come to SCSP. And so here I am.
I'm glad it did,
Very cool.
Venkat. Okay, let's talk about the memo.
Sure.
Obviously, governance has been the topic for many, many years now. I think the previous administration issued the White House AIEO. Trump administration really abolished that AIEO on the first day of this new administration. So, Rama, you and I have talked about this. We have worked on this. You have testified about this. Can you tell us a little bit about the approach you took when writing this memo? Why do you think now we have a chance to really put some governance, guardrails, framework, whatever you want to call it, around this technology? And what can we do about it, Venkat? Maybe you talk a little bit about the objectives and everything else.
We've been talking about this since 2019. I think we have to put this into the bigger context.
Right.
I mean, this is not a time where everything's great, all countries agree on what our value systems should be, or that there's no fight for tech dominance. There is a global competition for tech dominance because it determines whose values are going to be globally adopted. Is it going to be democracy? Is it going to be authoritarianism? It's going to determine, tech leadership determines whose economies are going to flourish, whose societies are going to prosper, who's going to have, military might. So I think given that competition, we have to think about AI governance with the context that we find ourselves in. Right. So it's not a time when we can put forth regulation and then figure out how much innovation we can have within that regulatory framework. And innovation is going to determine who is the tech leader.
Right.
So we have to determine what we need for innovation and the safeguards that will get us there. So the necessary safeguards that will get us there.
Right.
So we're not saying like there shouldn't be any regulation or there shouldn't be any safeguards. We're just talking about what's the most critical, highly consequential AI use cases that we need to focus on, because we can't regulate everything, especially when this AI is actually relatively new and it's just only going to grow from here. So we don't have the capacity to regulate all of AI development, all of AI use cases. So we're going to figure out what matters the most, whether those are beneficial impacts or harmful impacts. That's where we should put our regulatory focus.
Thank you, Rama. Venkat, let's talk a little bit about the objectives of the memo that you guys lay up front, and then we'll go and talk a little bit more in details about each of the recommendations and your ideas about how to do this.
Absolutely. So Rama mentioned the sort of context of this memo and what we're dropping into. And it's the fact that we're in a geopolitical, techno-economic competition with China. And at the same time, we're on the cusp of these next generation technologies reaching some level of maturity or go to market. And so it's really at this inflection time. And I think, Illy, you made a great point in your foreign policy piece that this next presidency could be the AGI presidency. So the objective of this memo is really about how do we create the conditions for the US innovation ecosystem to lead in the development of these next generation technologies, and then how do we create the structures, the left and right bumpers for that technology to be then leveraged for public good. And so we sort of break this into a few different recommendations. The first is called the Tech Forward Initiative. And that's all about how do we reduce regulatory burdens and obstacles that are hindering innovation in these key emerging technologies. The second, like Rama mentioned, is a focus on high consequence AI use cases. The third is about protecting kids' safety online. And finally, the fourth is a recognition that data is a key strategic asset that is going to unlock innovation, and recognizes that the government is uniquely positioned as a holder of highly important domain-specific data assets, and how can we create public-private partnerships in order to foster innovation by giving them access to this data.
Okay, these are all like heavy topics, and as you said, Rama, this is a difficult subject because how do you regulate something that is constantly evolving by the second almost, right? I mean, just in the last 2 years since the release of ChatGPT, you had more than, I think, 25 models that were released in public. So let's dive deeper into each of these recommendations. Let's start with the first one, the Tech Forward Initiative. What was your objective that you guys had with this recommendation, and how do you think we can execute it?
Yeah, that goes back to my point about how can we move forward with innovation with the bumpers that we know on the left and right side. And I think there's a lot of sort of bureaucratic hurdles that we can lift. So we need to build the infrastructure to grow AI, and that requires looking at the inputs into AI and making sure that those inputs that there's no barriers to getting those inputs to where they need to be. So, for example, environmental permits for data centers, for building data centers. It shouldn't be such a burdensome process, even when sometimes it's a burdensome process, even when it's not going to have much of an environmental impact. So we need to look at those processes to make sure that they're more efficient to get us where we need to be, to have the data inputs, to have the inputs we need to build the AI infrastructure that's going to be necessary. We need to make sure that foreign countries aren't imposing regulatory frameworks that is going to hurt United States companies, for example. And let me give you an example of that. So the EU Digital Markets Act, it is meant to regulate gatekeepers related to digital platforms. The gatekeepers are defined as large platforms with large volumes of users and really large revenues. Well, guess who that is? That's United States companies like Google, Meta, Amazon. And there's like a high compliance burden for these companies to fulfill these requirements of, one of the provisions is that these digital platforms can't preferentially identify their products. Well, that hurts them. It doesn't hurt EU companies because they don't fall under this categorical definition. So
Does it cover the Chinese companies?
It does cover Chinese companies, but I would say that the United States companies are still predominant number of them.
Right.
But we also need to have mechanisms to expedite processes that we know that we want. So, for example, as a model, we should use the FDA model for expediting certain devices and pharmaceuticals. But we need to use those kinds of mechanisms to make sure that we're strategically, making our processes more efficient to get the inputs that we need for building our AI infrastructure.
Right. Moving on to the second recommendation. This is not a new recommendation,
Right.
but this is one of those things in which, when you did it first, Rama, I think it didn't get a lot of traction, but because there was a lot of noise around AI governance. I think we went from let's regulate the whole thing, to no, it doesn't make sense to regulate the whole thing, to what can we then regulate, which I think your idea was spot on, focusing on high consequential cases. So can one of you elaborate more about what does it really mean? How does this impact really a daily AI application that could hinder somebody's life, well-being, even threatening his existence or her existence?
Yeah, I think this recommendation really comes with the recognition that AI is a general purpose technology. The use cases that it can be applied to is vast. And so it's just not feasible given the current resources that regulators have to regulate every single use case. And so our thinking is you should regulate the highly consequential AI use cases. So we think of healthcare, defense, energy, infrastructure, education. These are the ones where the impacts, either positive or negative, of these use cases can be very high. And so it mandates that regulators should pay special attention and consideration to these AI use cases.
So here's the rationale for the high consequence, focusing our regulatory efforts on highly consequential AI use cases. As Venkat said, we can't regulate everything. But we need to figure out where to put those regulatory efforts. So for example, the EU AI Act, it also adopts a risk-based approach. So they define AI use cases in different categories. So for example, they have banned AI use cases, certain AI use cases, like for example, that can't be used at all, like for surveillance or social scoring. And then they have a category called high-risk AI use cases, and they have some controls for that AI use case. And then the lowest category is minimal risk. So AI risk that's not going to have a big impact on society. So we're going to give that a little less focus. Here in the United States, we also talk about high-risk AI use cases. But we don't really have a framework for what that means. What is a high-risk AI use case? So that's why we, the AI governance team, issued the high consequence framework in collaboration with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory that sets out a framework for how you can identify highly consequential AI use cases. And there's one more thing. So the EU AI Act, they're really just worried about risks. We also need to be worried about harms that AI use cases can bring to our society, but we also need to be concerned with AI use cases that could do really good things for our people. right? So we want to identify those applications that are going to have the most significant impacts in society. And that's where we
Right,
should be
right,
focusing our regulation.
And then Rama, just to get one level down, how would that look in practicality? In my mind, for example, when you talk about high consequence cases, you look at FDA, you look at FAA, you look at DoD or CIA. Each of these departments and agencies or bureaus will focus only on identifying the applications they have, or the way they're using AI and applying it towards a specific problem for their mission or to execute, their roles and responsibilities. And the high consequence would be identifying what harm will it do in the society against a group, ethnicity, or something, right?
Right. And you're right. This is going to have to be sector specific.
Right.
Because the issues are
Yeah, that's a good point. Sector specific is
because it's going to be the issues are going to be very different.
Exactly.
So when you're looking at, for example, transportation, our road work,
Right.
our roadways, and with vehicles and with self-driving cars, those are going to bring about different issues than, for example, AI applications that are for children, right?
Right.
So the harms are different, the benefits are different. So you're going to have to apply the framework according to what you know about your sector, what makes sense in your sector. At the same time,
And what are the risks?
and what are the risks and benefits exactly. And so we need that sector expertise, and there should also be a way to sort of standardize these framework across sectors, so that the public, so that the industry has some sort of certainty of what's going to be identified as highly consequential.
Right.
And I think a good first step for this is actually something that was already been done, which is each agency catalogs and categorizes their AI-specific use cases. And so once you have a catalog of it, you can apply this framework and see which ones are highly consequential. So even having a landscape of all the ways AI could be used in that sector is a good first step.
And you can imagine that once a department or agency starts doing this, they're going to sort of get the experience on how to categorize these AI use cases, right? And so the more cases that are identified as highly consequential, it gives the public and industry more information on what they're looking at.
And to focus on one particular group that needs protecting, really, one of your recommendations deals with children and their safety online. So can you elaborate more? Why do you think this is the right approach? This has been talked for many, many years now. I think Congress has been dragging its feet. The White House has tried time and again, but I think we're still in this space in which there's no real protection for what children are exposed to online. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys approach this and what is your recommendation?
Sure. I mean, this is sort of an easy one because I think everyone agrees that we need to protect our children.
Everyone
on digital
agrees, but
platforms,
nobody
right?
wants to do anything.
And everyone also agrees that we're a
Right.
little bit late to this one, but given social media, and we didn't really
Right.
put anything in place before we knew the effects of social media. So the point here is that we need someone looking after children's protection. So we recommended a officer, a staff in the Federal Trade Commission be established to look after the safeguards for children.
Why there, Rama, if I can ask?
So sure, the FTC, their roles and responsibility is to look at consumer protection,
Right.
data privacy, data security, and they also have enforcement mechanisms, right? They can investigate companies and look into, and they have that communication mechanisms to look at companies, to put forward voluntary mechanisms, for example. So we thought that was the best place for this. Anything to add?
Yeah. The FTC also was a natural place for this because they have experience in protecting kids' online safety experience. So they are the ones tasked with enforcing COPPA, Child Online Privacy Protection Rule. So they've already worked with private industry on voluntary frameworks and compliance requirements and already have experience with COPPA. And the other place we considered was FCC, but their jurisdiction is more narrow. It's more focused on telecommunications and Broadcom. So we just thought FTC was a more natural fit given their experience.
Makes sense. Last recommendation really is something we wrote in the past about this. But I think here really we're taking a look at how can data become a source of innovation or accelerating even more our innovation. So can you talk a little bit more about how do you view data as a national asset? What should we do about it? How we should get organized around this? we have had many attempts around organizing ourselves around data and use it as an asset to help with economic growth, accelerate innovation, help with national security issues, etc.
Sure. So AI is only as capable as the data that it's trained on. So data is a very critical input to AI technologies. And we don't have a strategy here in the United States on how to recognize and treat data as a national asset. How do we make sure that we are freely making it freely accessible? All the data we have in public sectors, industry, how can we make more data accessible and usable? So how can we have public-private partnerships, for example, between government, public sectors and private sectors to get better insights into data sets? Let me give you an example. So looking at supply chain resiliency, if we had public sector data as well as private data, looking at, for example, the supply chain for semiconductors, I think we would have better insight than just looking at the public data that we have for the supply chain or just looking at the private data sets that we have for the supply chain for semiconductors. If we put that all together, we have better insights into where are there vulnerabilities in the supply chain, what are the timelines, et cetera. So I think that's one of the important things about recognizing data as an asset.
Venkat?
Yeah, and AI innovation specifically requires a few key inputs, right? So for there to be innovation that results from it, you need data, you need reasoning, which is the models, and you also need tools. The USG maybe has a comparative advantage in data assets. And so we should combine that with other players in the ecosystem that have comparative advantages in other aspects and inputs. So OpenAI or one of these frontier labs has a comparative advantage in reasoning, in models. Mm-hmm. So why don't we create public-private partnerships where we combine our individual comparative advantages to then propel innovation? Sort of the thought behind these PPPs.
Okay, we talked about the national data strategy, but in your mind, how should government approach data?
It's already taking efforts in this area, right? So there's a lot, the government holds a lot of valuable data. How can it make it more usable and more accessible to the people who can actually use it to use AI on it to get great insights? So, for example, the Department of Commerce is taking efforts to make its data more usable and accessible. And we need policies where there is data from one agency can easily be used by another agency. So we need standardization policies to make that possible.
Right. Venkat, anything to add?
And the way we recommend this happen is that we recommend a national chief data officer to sit in the White House,
right,
who sort of coordinates all of these interagency data assets, creates standardization protocols.
And this is a recommendation that we have not had in the past, nor the position has existed, right?
The position doesn't exist, but we did recommend this as our national data action plan.
Right. So I feel like the last couple of years, this conversation around AI and governance, we approached it, not we as SCSP, but I think our country and so our allies probably, we have approached it from a risk and safety perspective. And that became the angle of looking at AI on anything, how much risk does it have? What are the safety implications? And so I think then the conversation got skewed more towards the risk and safety, without understanding the opportunities that AI has in front of us. And I'm not that we should be all positive about AI. I think there's a right middle balance where you can find there. And so what do you think the next 4 years we can do to balance this conversation? What are the some opportunities to help us unleash the potential of AI?
I'll give you one example. I think we need to find processes where we can expedite the review process for certain inputs into the AI infrastructure. So if we find an AI application case that's going to have incredible benefits, for example, in healthcare or education, that should be looked at in a quick, efficient manner. It shouldn't have to go through bureaucratic hurdles. before it's approved. I think the other side of that is barriers and hurdles. So, Venkat, do you have an example of where there might be a barrier to inputs into AI infrastructure?
Yeah. So regulation serves many purposes. One is that it sort of prevents market failures and addresses some safety concerns, but other times it just disproportionately hinders innovation. And so one example where we're seeing that it's hindering progress in AI is in building next generation data centers. So these data centers are going to consume anywhere from 1 to 5 gigawatts of energy. And you can think of 1 gigawatt of energy as being providing energy for approximately 750,000 homes.
Right.
That is a medium-sized U.S. city.
Right.
And one data center, AI data center, might consume 5 equivalents of medium-sized cities worth of energy. And so that just requires historical levels of investment in infrastructure.
And relooking at the whole infrastructure, like perspective of how you build stuff.
Yes, and current regulations around environmental permitting just do not meet where we need to be in terms of innovation speed, right? And if we address this with the fact that we're in a competition with China, who moves much quicker, who has much more experience in building out massive infrastructure projects, we fundamentally need to reorient our regulatory and innovation landscape to then meet this challenge and go face this competition.
Thank you so much. I mean, first of all, thank you for the work you've done on the memo. I know this is not an easy topic. I mean, this is one of the most probably catch-22 topics I've encountered in the last 6 years working on AI-related issues. And if it was easy, I think we would have solved it a long time ago. I think Congress would have passed the legislation a long time ago if this was easy. Before we end our podcast, I like to ask all our guests, all my guests, I hope we have students, people that are thinking about coming to Washington, serving in departments and agencies. I mean, we're surrounded by a lot of young people here that come from all over the country and spend, a semester with us or a summer being an intern. Why, if you're a graduate student anywhere in America, why would you come to Washington? Why would you serve, in any of the departments and agencies? Let's start with you, Rama, since you have more experience.
Sure. 2 reasons. One is now's the time. It's a high stakes time for the United States. So that's a great time to make an influence on the trajectory of the United States. And the second reason is AI. It's an incredibly transformative technology. It's going to change our world. You should want to be a part of that to make sure that it's being shaped in the way that was good for America, for the American people. And that's just a great time. Because of those 2 reasons, it's just a great time to be in government.
Right. Venkat, you served on the Hill.
Yes.
What's your recommendation?
I completely agree with Rama. We're at a pivotal inflection point. Personally, though, I think the learning velocity that you have when you work in government or on the Hill is just unparalleled. You have an outsized responsibility, you have outsized potential for impact, and you cover a wide range of issues with a lot of depth. And so just your learning velocity is much higher relative to some of the other places that I've worked. So definitely a great opportunity for folks starting their career.
And I've been in both the public and private sectors, and I have to say that because it's government, you get experiences, bigger and better experiences in the public sector much earlier in your career than you would in the private sector.
Thank you both for authoring the memo. Again, to our audience and listeners, this is a memo for the president on the governance-related issues. Thank you for tuning and watching this conversation, and I'll see you next time.